It's an odd feeling to be the survivor of child abuse. It's an admission that you sometimes have to validate for yourself, even after the same consensus is reached by those around you. I was never taken from my parents, and there were no reports, to my knowledge, made to the Department of Human Services about how my parents treated me. No police reports indicating I was abused. So that leaves me today to think, was it really that bad? Am I being dramatic or misremembering? I can't just decide that's what happened to me, can I? At times in my life, I've told myself everyone goes through some trauma, especially as a child, and I believe that's true. When I'm done with my speech today, I hope you remember this. I'm one of many, way too many children who have survived child abuse. My story is more severe than some and less severe than others. My earliest memory was when I was 5 years old. I was crawling on my hands and knees out of my bedroom and down the hallway. It was the middle of the night and my parents were having a party. The music was loud and so were the people. A pile of white powder was mounted in the middle of the kitchen table, and the people were sniffing it into their noses through rolled-up dollar bills. My father caught me peeking around the corner and angrily picked me up and threw me into my bedroom. He yelled at me to stay put and to not come back out. My 9-year-old brother and 6-year-old sister were also in the room. My brother brightly consoled me, telling me everything was all right, and he directed my attention to a cartoon playing on TV. Thinking back, I remember vividly why I had snuck out in the first place. I hadn't been tucked in for the night. My mom hadn't tucked me in. Our house had 2 settings, the dangerous quiet of neglect or the chaos of drug parties and my parents screaming at each other. We were the dirty kids at school, eating handfuls of dry cat food and watching out for ourselves and each other. By the time I started first grade, my father had realized the damage he and my mother were causing. He enrolled in technical school and left us to live away from the chaos and get straightened out. My mother continued using cocaine and became romantically intimate with her drug dealer. He moved in with us. He did terrible things that I'm not speaking about today because that bleeds into another sibling's story, and I won't tell another person's story of abuse, but I can share that he hurt us horribly in different ways. Word spread among my parents' friends that my father was getting clean. Some within the group suspected my father was going to rat on them. This led to death threats, and these threats worried my father enough to send my sister, brother, and I to live with my Aunt Bobby in Illinois. My Aunt Bobby is an angel who walks this earth. A single mom of 3, she took us in without hesitation. We had hot meals every night, which included vegetables, much to my chagrin. She gave my brother, my sister, and I a safe place to stay, and did it so lovingly. She checked our homework, took us to school functions, and looked after us. For a brief period of time, she met our needs and nourished our desires for a normal childhood. But it wasn't long until my siblings and I moved back to Colorado. The drug dealer boyfriend had been murdered, and my dad said it was safe to come back home. Both my parents were on the path to getting their lives back, but separately. The drugs had caused their already unsteady marriage to crack, and divorce was on the horizon. My siblings and I had to choose, mom or dad. My brother and sister chose to live with my father. I couldn't see my mother alone, so I chose her. It's hard to explain who my mother was. She was complicated. She had a witty sense of humor, she was an unfaltering champion of the underdog, and she had a desire to be and do good. But most of the time, and during the times that mattered most to me, she was a revolving door of cruelty, anger, mania, and paranoia. There was no doubt to the people around her she had some degree of behavioral or mood disorder, but she never sought help for it and was never diagnosed. You were either my mother's best friend or you were the worst person on the planet. There was no in-between. She disowned more friends than she kept. Her road rage crept into extremely dangerous territory, following other drivers for miles or attempting to ram them on the highway. The smallest things would cause the biggest reactions in her. For brief bursts of time, my mother could be fun. We would have disco dancing parties in our living room, and there was always some sort of activity, rollerblading, tennis, plays, that she'd want us to do together. The only problem was the activity would inevitably be destroyed by her mood swings. Well-intentioned but poorly planned outings with her children would end with her crying and throwing her purse down the street in frustration. Spur-of-the-moment shopping sprees at Kmart would end with my mother being escorted out by security as she screamed at the cashier who couldn't accept her bounced check. Chaos followed us everywhere. My mother also couldn't keep a job. She found and lost countless jobs before starting her own house cleaning business. She had lots of clients, but not much money. Most of the time, it was just enough for us to get by. Due to my mother's impulsiveness and other circumstances of poverty, we moved a lot. I became the professional new kid at school. On my first day at each new school, I would tell myself, I don't care, I don't need new friends, until I believed it. The nature of my mother's illness isolated us, and so she and I were very close. My mother confided in me about everything: money troubles, dating, the latest horrible thing my father had done to spite her. She told me about the awful abuses she suffered as a child. No topic was out of bounds for her 11-year-old daughter to see or to hear. When it came to my thoughts, my troubles, feelings, the street did not go two ways. Time and time again, I was reminded to tread lightly with the information I shared with my mother. One thing I kept from her was my fondness of my stepmom, Trish. It's not hyperbolic to say my mom hated her. She accused her and my father of brainwashing my older siblings into not wanting to see her anymore. She thought Trish was trying to take her kids away. So I kept my mouth shut and my love of Trish hidden from her cruelty. Trish is only 18 years older than me, and when I was 11, Trish was cool. I examined her admiringly. How she did her hair, or the earrings she wore, or how she would decorate a cake at the bakery where she worked. I watched longingly at how she played with my little stepsister and half-brother, how she didn't lose her patience so easily or take it out on them when she was having a bad day. One time, Trish invited me to run some errands with her, such a simple thing. I got to ride in the front seat with her, and the windows were cracked to allow the summer breeze in. Trish shared a bag of sunflower seeds with me. We cracked seeds and tossed them out the window as Van Morrison played on the radio. The entire day, I swore, was washed in a golden glow. Trish felt no need to flip anyone off or rage at our fellow drivers. There was no anger in her, no volatility. She was just peace personified. I didn't need to keep my guard up. I could just be a little girl, free to think little girl thoughts and feel little girl emotions. Trish taught me what a kind person looked like. And on that drive, I made a mental note. One day, I'm going to be just like Trish. One time, I was invited to a girls' tea party. All the girls from church were going to dress up, drink tea, and eat biscuits. It was a big deal. My mother and I were very excited and made a whole day out of getting me ready for it. We went shopping at a department store where I found a velvety green dress with a shawl to wrap around it. My mother curled my hair, and my aunt let me borrow her emerald necklace that matched the dress perfectly. I had never felt so elegant and beautiful. I could barely look at myself in the mirror. I felt bashful at how nice I looked. My aunt and my mother doted over me and took pictures to commemorate the day. My mother dropped me off at the party. Afterwards, one of the mothers at the event drove me home. I was so excited to tell my mom all about the elegant affair. I opened the door and my mother was standing there waiting for me. "Did you have fun, sweetheart?" she slithered. I knew this tone so well by now. She was enraged. Her hair was a mess and her eyes were bloodshot. It was apparent she had been raging for a while. The trailer was a mess, with decorations and books thrown around. I did what I always did in these moments. I hid deep inside my brain. My heart flopped up and down like a fish out of water. My mouth pooled with saliva. I breathed steadily, but only out of my nose, letting oxygen into my brain slower than it needed it. My body tensed. I looked straight ahead. I didn't know what I had done to make her mad, but it must have been something horrible, so I racked my brain. My mother finally clued me in through her verbal assault. She was convinced the church mothers were bashing her at the tea party. They were talking about her and making fun of her, and I was somehow complicit in all of it. I was confused. A few hours prior, we were giggling as she did my hair and told me nice things, and now I was on the receiving end of psychological warfare. Tears started to come, as hard as I tried not to let them. She pulled my chin so I was inches from her face. "Stop your fucking crying, little girl," she warned. I stood at attention. There was little use in denying her allegations or saying anything. I had no defense. I waited until she was tired of yelling. The next morning, all was back to normal. There was no further discussion, no follow-up conversation. The only evidence of the assault was the mess in the living room. She was over her anger and life carried on. How do you stop a little girl from having feelings? I began to want to disappear. I couldn't stop my mother's cruelty no matter what I had tried. I did not want to exist. With every chaotic episode I endured, I slipped further from reality. In 1999, my mother and father hit an impasse with a rickety, out-of-court custody schedule of myself and my 2 older siblings. An attorney representative was hired to determine the best interests of our children. During my interview, the attorney asked me how I liked living with my mother. I don't remember exactly what I said, but what he wrote in the report was, Tally appears to be closer to her mother than her siblings. She worries her mother will be alone if Tally does not live with her. Now, I had no idea this attorney's job was to write a report detailing this interview, and I was not informed that my mother and father would be given this report, but they were. When my mother picked me up after school the day she received the report, the assault was immediate. She whipped the report in my face. My mind raced. What did I do this time? As she sped through the small town streets, she screamed as loud as she could. How dare you, she started. If you hate living with me so much, little girl, she said, then you can run off with your dad and your perfect stepmommy. I don't need you. You think I need you? You're not doing me any favors by living with me. When we got to our trailer, she ordered me to pack my suitcase. She was going to send me to live with my dad. I packed as fast as I could, terrified of her rage, while she threw dishes, books, and furniture around the house. I finished, stepped out of my bedroom, and looked at the floor, awaiting further instruction. She stared at me for what seemed like hours. I'm done packing, I murmured. Where do you think you're going? She scoffed. You're not going anywhere. She walked away from me. I went back into my bedroom and I unpacked. That night I cried as hard as I could while still being silent. I knew even at 11 that I was depressed. There was something very wrong. I could feel it. I started inflicting self-harm. I'd sit in my bedroom, light a lighter for a long while, then shove the searing metal from the lighter into my forearm until it stopped hurting. I don't even know where I learned this. It was like it was invented in the saddest part of my brain. I attempted to confide in my mother about this. I waited until she was in one of her manic, elated moods and said, Ma, I think I'm depressed. She laughed like I had just told her a joke and said, I'm the one that's depressed, not you. Then she turned up the car radio and happily sang along as we drove. Luckily, I had Mrs. Nunley, my middle school guidance counselor. The school days after the hardest nights were spent in her office. She would turn off the fluorescent lights and light the room with desk lamps, turn on peaceful music, and make me apple cinnamon tea. In her office, I was allowed to cry and I wasn't pressured to stop. Mrs. Nunley knew I was sad at home and felt hopeless, but I think she also sensed my skittishness. I would never come back to her office if I thought she'd intervene in a way that would make home life worse. I believe she addressed these office visits with my parents with no result. Mrs. Nunley couldn't save me from my mother's abuse, but her office visits saved me from my overwhelming inner despair. Mrs. Nunley taught me how to be my own ally, how to love and nurture myself when my parents could not. One day in 8th grade, some friends invited me to hang out after school. I ran to my dad's house where I called my mother to ask permission to stay longer. She said that was fine as long as someone could give me a ride home afterwards. My 16-year-old brother said he would, so I went back to playing with my friends. When I told my brother it was time to go home, he had changed his mind. He didn't feel like driving me home. The hairs on my body stood up, and I started to panic. I begged and pleaded with my brother, but he wouldn't budge. I'd have to call my mother and tell her I needed a ride after all. Ma, he doesn't want to take me anymore, I conceded. There was a long silence. Your ass better be waiting outside when I pull up, and you're never seeing your dad again. She hung up. I set the phone back on the receiver, slung my backpack over my shoulder, and quietly walked out to the front porch. I sat on the bench staring forward. My night was decided for me. I really had it. I was really in for it this time. I hid inside myself again, and I worked hard not to cry. I couldn't add gasoline to the fire by looking like I'd been crying when she picked me up. My father saw my sadness, followed me out to the porch, and sat next to me. My dad and I would have a tumultuous relationship throughout the rest of my childhood, but in this particular moment, he saved my life. He put his arm around me and he said, you know, you don't have to go home. I glanced at him. Who was he kidding? I didn't get to just not go home. That had never happened without an all-out war between my parents. He held me tighter and my body convulsed. defying my stubborn mind, pushing painful sobs to the surface. You just say the word, Tally. You tell me you don't want to go home and I'll handle your mom. My head sunk as far down my chest as it could as I exhaled between sobs. This was it. My words would be the pin to the grenade that I would throw at my life. I knew if I were to get in my mother's car that day, something bad was going to happen, either to me or to her. I finally surrendered and told my dad I didn't want to go home. After I spoke those fateful words, my dad took immediate action. Okay, go in the house and don't come out, he said. My mom soon pulled up into the driveway, surprised not to see me but my dad. The screaming match began. I paced the kitchen. My body was in a panic. My lips were buzzing. This isn't going to work, I thought. This isn't going to work. She's going to get me back and she's going to kill me. Or I'm going to kill her or I'm going to kill myself. I locked myself in the bathroom. I had so much pent-up energy I couldn't handle, and for reasons unknown to me, I grabbed some tweezers. I dragged them across my arm as fast and with as much pressure as I could. I wasn't in control of my body. The police came. They ordered my mother to leave, and they allowed my father to keep me overnight. My mother was parked in a red pickup across the street, obsessively watching us. She wouldn't leave. The police were called again, and they made her leave. Until the trial, I was safe, but I was a refugee in foreign land. I didn't have any clothes or personal belongings with me at my dad's house. The authorities ordered my mother to pack up some things for my father and my brother to pick up. They pulled up to the trailer to find my things thrown across the yard in a frenzy. Not in bags or boxes. My clothing, toothbrush, my underwear, all as singular items for the weather to touch and the neighbors to see. It wasn't until later that I learned she had kept something of mine for herself. The court hearing took several days. Arguments were made on both sides about who was the less fit parent. My mother, I was told, acted just as erratically as normal. Things weren't looking good for her thanks to her uncontrollable behavioral issues. But she did have one thing against my father. My diary, which she marked up and read out loud to the courtroom. I wasn't at the hearing, so my dad was the one to inform me she had read my diary aloud. He sat down, looked sadder than I'd ever seen him look in my life, and he said, "Tally, I have to tell you something." He handed me the notebook with the familiar cover, bookmarked with the sticky notes of my mother's handwriting. I didn't need him to tell me what the next thing he said, because I already understood. But he said, "Tally, she read your diary to the judge." I wept. I felt like I had no clothes on in that moment. I was humiliated to my core. I looked at my dad and I said, "I'm so sorry, Dad," because I knew exactly what I had written, and I knew, by the pages she had marked, which entry she decided to read. Things involving my dad's lax rules at his house, boyfriends I secretly had, and other very private things. The entries she read were relatively benign, things I think any 12-year-old would have written. But it was evident to me in that moment that there was nothing my mother wouldn't do, no boundary of mine she wouldn't violate to keep me as her emotional slave. I was not my own. Out of everything she has ever done to me, my mother reading my diary as evidence in court is still the most painful thing. The hearing ended somewhat abruptly. After days of arguing back and forth, my mother finally looked around the room and said, "Fine, you win. I don't even fucking want her anymore." She stormed out, and that's how it ended between my mother and me. And I've not seen my mother since. My teenage years were brutal and full of anger. I had lots of trauma to work through while dealing with my father's alcoholism and his own set of boundary violations. But the good news is, when I turned 18, my memories of hard times were erased. I became an official, high-functioning adult, and I never looked back. I had no residual pain of my childhood, and I was granted a perfect adulthood. Right? Of course, that's not true. That's not how it works. Trauma is a scar that leaves evidence on a soul for the rest of its existence. It flares up when difficult situations arise, and it's there to remind the host, sometimes at odd times, that they've been hurt very, very badly. Adults who have gone through childhood trauma have an uphill battle. Some of us, despite years of clinical intervention, are still timid, still waiting for the other shoe to drop decades later. We're scared of our own reflection, afraid that one day we'll look and see our abusers staring back. We hold latent anger and question our worth, our desires, and our relationships. But our capacity to love is gargantuan because we know what it feels like to be denied love, safety, and a sense of peace. And for those of us who are fortunate enough to have champions or mentors who hold us up when our parents themselves could not, we understand the value of an advocate. Our advocates invited us to the other side of the wall of abuse and said, yes, you too deserve a life of love and peace. You are allowed to have kindness and goodness shine on your shoulders, and I'm going to remind you of this until you see the light and feel the warmth there yourself. Hang in, hang on, and trust me when I tell you that you're worth it. Where would I be today without my advocates, without those beautiful people who blessed me, Mrs. Nunley, Aunt Bobby, Trish, and so many other adults in my life, with compassion and kindness and a chance to be a child? I suppose I could ask another question. Where would I be today if my mother had received the advocacy she so desperately needed? As damaging as she was to me, I know in my heart my mother did not intend to be an abusive parent. She was dealing with a very serious imbalance in her brain, likely aggravated by her own childhood abuse. But with the help, patience, and guidance of my mentors and advocates, I've had the support I so desperately need to break the cycle of abuse. I'm a mother myself now. I have the most beautiful, most special daughter in the world. She turns 1 next week. And I take great pride in making sure that she's tucked in every night and has good food in her belly, and that she has love surrounding her daily. Because she deserves it. The amount of power I have over her development, well-being, and happiness terrifies me sometimes, but I will work like hell to protect her from the traumas that I endured. It helps immensely that my daughter doesn't just have me. She's the lucky winner of the dad lottery as well. My husband is so very great. We run a business together, we look after each other's hearts, and we share 50-50 in our parental duties. I cherish my precious life more than I can tell this audience here today. It's more beautiful than the little 12-year-old me could ever have hoped for. This is why I'm a CASA myself. A child needs hope. When a child's hands are void of hope, they have space to pick up anger and resentment, and they are apt to carry those things into adulthood. I know firsthand how an advocate can reshape a child and the ripple effect they can have on future generations. While I cannot single-handedly heal my CASA kid's scars of the traumas he's endured, and while I cannot even guarantee that the hard times are over, I can remind him he's important and worthy of everything good this world has to offer. When he tells me, sometimes I'm a bad kid, as if it were a simple fact of his DNA makeup, I'm there to shake my head and tell him, nope, that's not even a little bit true. Because there's just simply no such thing as a bad kid. There are only good kids who are deserving of love and patience and acceptance and hope. Today, you have an opportunity to be hope for a child, to give them a better, brighter future than they ever dreamed. There are 600 children in need of a CASA volunteer right here, right now in our community. Last year, we served half of them. I ask you today to consider a gift to support this amazing organization. Or perhaps consider giving your time and compassion to becoming a CASA yourself. To support the child who feels alone and unheard. To empower the sad little child who needs to be told that they matter. Together, let's change a child's story.